two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. I'm here today with Michael Burns. He's a permaculture farmer in Schuyler County these days, but he's been many other places in earlier parts of his life. We're going to talk about Chiapas and the Zapatistas. I first heard about this weird uprising in southern Mexico, the province of Chiapas, by a group called the Zapatistas. Michael knows a lot more about it than I do, so I'm going to turn this over to Michael Burns, who will tell that story and then how he himself went there a few years later.
As you said, we should start with a little bit of historical context. If you look at a map of Mexico, what would be the southernmost state that borders Guatemala is Chiapas. One of its largest cities is San Cristobal. It's mostly mountainous, and much of the population is indigenous Maya. Okay, of course, there are Ladinos and other folks of European descent as well. And I think for a long time in Mexican history, the Maya have never been truly what some might call assimilated into Mexican society. And simultaneously, they've often been one of the more oppressed sort of indigenous minorities in sort of the Mexican society. I believe it was January 94, on New Year's Day, when NAFTA went into effect. The Zapatista Army, as it was called, of National Liberation, took over 8 rural towns and 1 city in Chiapas. And it was striking and sort of captured the attention of some of the news because it was, after all, the first day of Mexico, the United States, and Canada officially being under the NAFTA treaty. And immediately there's an uprising in one of the parties of NAFTA. So there's been a history of uprisings. Emiliano Zapata was a Mexican revolutionary who was part of the turmoil and of the Mexican Revolution in the early 1900s. In this case, within 2 weeks of that uprising, the Zapatistas had been driven out of the towns and cities back into the mountains, but simultaneously, hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million Mexicans turned out in Mexico City and other cities calling for peace. These were citizens groups that weren't in any affiliated or perhaps even aware of the Zapatistas beforehand, like a lot of us were unaware. And they were essentially calling on the government to take a peaceful approach to ending this conflict. I'll just insert a little bit of my story into this and how I sort of fell into this scenario. When I was much younger, without gray hair, I had been working with sort of public health activists, largely helping coordinate medical aid into Nicaragua and other Central American countries. A lot of the work was supporting the new public health care system of Nicaragua under the Sandinistas, should I say, the old Sandinistas. And it was a very sort of inspiring time because Nicaragua was massively cutting its child mortality rate. Literacy was skyrocketing. And I happened to be a young person in New York City who was inspired by it and also, essentially got a job doing administrative work for an organization that was coordinating a lot of this medical aid, National Central American Health Rights Network. And in the process, I learned a lot, not only just about how aid gets delivered and sometimes lost or disappeared, I also ended up learning a lot about U.S. imperialism, in particular against Nicaragua, but ultimately in Honduras and certainly El Salvador and Guatemala. A lot of our work was helping public health nurses, doctors, and administrators around the U.S. pair up with public clinics in Nicaragua and to help those Nicaraguan clinics sort of meet some of their most basic needs for usually medicine and sometimes medical equipment. We have to remember there was an embargo against Nicaragua, and yet much of Nicaraguan's medical infrastructure in Managua was American made parts and the training and so what have you. So in this milieu, I became involved in helping to provide medical aid to communities that are suffering from conflicts. It was mostly to Nicaragua. When there was an uprising in El Salvador in 1989, we also had to ship a lot of medicines in because the government was engaging in aerial bombardment of neighborhoods where the rebels were or supposedly were. And all medicine coming into the country was being sort of appropriated by the Salvadorian military. It often felt like we were sneaking the medicines into El Salvador, even though no law was being broken. But the problem was a shipment would arrive and the military would confiscate it. So I was mainly just an administrator at this point, watching my older, more experienced colleagues try to execute some of these medical shipments. And same thing with Nicaragua, trying to find legal or otherwise means of getting basic medicines into Nicaragua when there was an embargo. So in all this background, I carried on the rest of my life in New York City as a working person and often volunteering, usually for fundraising events, honestly, for these types of projects. And in 1994, when the uprising happened, a lot of North Americans in New York City who had experience delivering aid to conflict zones started to network. And in the process, a group of organizations in New York City had established relationships with communities in Chiapas, Mexico. And so now this is 4 years into the conflict, which started in 94. So now it's 1998. And the shooting war was essentially almost over with. So there was a relative ceasefire. And what had really been happening over the year, there was a lot going on in Mexico at this time too, including presidential candidates being assassinated, and the beginning of the Revolutionary Institutional Party of Mexico, which had held power for 70 years, was losing its grip on power. And Chiapas became part of this rich, complicated, sort of time in Mexico. And so by 98, some of the actual conflict that was happening with paramilitaries or old sort of private police units. They called them white guards that plantation owners had operated for a century or more. White guards were basically private security for plantations. So much of the real challenge was with these white guards and with the apparent assistance of the Mexican military or them turning their eyes and letting things happen. So, but by 98, by chance, I had left my job, and a couple of folks who I had done fundraising with on behalf of these communities in resistance, we might call them, in Chiapas, invited me. It was, a rare, they basically invited a few of us to come down and see where our donations were going and how they were being spent. And, our response in return was, yes, and let us come help. And a lot of the money that was going down was helping build or rebuild water systems. A lot of public health folks working in rural Latin America were worried about clean drinking water and well-designed latrines and cooking fires. Those three areas are related to public health very intimately, or very, when you have clean drinking water, when your latrines aren't spoiling your drinking water, and when your cooking fires aren't smoking up a kitchen, getting into the people's lungs, a lot of health problems disappear. And so by 98, many of the larger aid organizations, or we should say development organizations, have been pushed out of Chiapas by the conflict. And some of these aid organizations were relying on those who volunteered to carry out projects or finish projects because and the problem here is because of the conflict, there were fewer international citizens around. And the worry was the conflict in Chiapas might devolve into what we had in Guatemala, which was years and years of genocidal, repression of Maya communities. And so I was part of this very loosely aligned network of public health activists in North America who were pairing up with aid organizations and going into the conflict zone to try to carry out public health projects and simultaneously just be eyes and ears for the rest of the world in case something happened. And there had been a massacre about 2 months prior to my arrival that was considered, it was called the Actial massacre. And that was pretty significant. But other than that, things were mellowing out, and having aid workers traveling through the conflict zone did have sort of a pacifying effect on some of these soldiers. So that brings us to 98 and sort of the beginning of my experience in Mexico. So should I go on?
Yes,
Any
of course.
questions
Well,
about what
I can say this is actually not totally a first for this program, but the late 1990s interviews that not I was on crew. Gene Finley was doing the interviewing, and we interviewed, I believe it was Ann Peters, who had been down there. And I remember her talking about, oh yes, and I communicate with my family from the internet cafe in San Cristobal de las Casas. Go on, take it from there.
Yeah, and actually that's good to mention, because this is the era of the internet. And much of the world was learning the details of the Zapatista uprising through email lists at the time, listservs, because the rebels themselves had email addresses and were showing up in San Cristobal and other places and uploading their messages, including the somewhat famous Subcomandante Marcos, who was actually a mixed race person from central Mexico who had joined or had moved into this indigenous area probably 20 something years previous. And that's a whole nother story. But because he was a bit of a poet and he was able to produce such interesting commentary and communiques via the internet, the news spread quickly. And the Zapatistas were, if you look at the anti-globalization protests in the late 90s, you see where there was both inspiration and almost direct causality out of some of the public meetings and communiques that the Zapatistas had been putting out in the previous 4 or 5 years. So the internet cafe was part of this experience. It actually allowed, and it made people feel very optimistic about the potential of democratizing the internet, allowing people. So in this case, going back to San Cristobal internet cafes, by the time I arrived, I was by far not the only person showing up in Chiapas as an internationalist, you could say, to support the movement. And of course, once you get there, there was a point where the community is in resistance. And I should clarify, when we talk about the Zapatista uprising, the Zapatista were a militant group with not that many working guns, but they were really there to represent the resistance, especially when, the initial uprising was kind of quashed after a couple of weeks. Very quickly, the Zapatista movement on the ground in southern Mexico became about what are we doing? What do the communities want? And what are we doing? And with a large number of Europeans, North Americans, Mexicans, Argentinians, and so on, flocking to Chiapas, there was an organization created called Enlace Civil, whose job it was kind of to channel all these well-intentioned and sometimes well-organized and sometimes well-funded North American and international volunteers. In our case, because some folks in New York City had set up a relationship with a few leaders and communities in a particular area of Chiapas. We, by chance, or maybe by luck, weren't really part of the Enlace Civil, but Enlace Civil was sending people into towns. Just, 4 or 5, perhaps, say, North Americans might go to a town and they would work beside the campesinos and just be eyes and ears. In this case, because we were on an actual aid development project, we sort of circumvented that. And we were working on the communities that were in resistance were shall we say, the ones who actually told the armed militants what to do or not do. Okay, and the communities in resistance were organized around certain aguas calientes, they call them. It's a rich historical term in Mexico, but the aguas calientes were sort of administrative centers for the communities in resistance.
What is that exactly? What does it even mean?
So it means hot springs.
Hot springs, huh?
But it's a reference.
Boiling waters.
It's a reference. Exactly. And it's a reference, however, to a meeting place of, it was either Pancho Villa or Emiliano Zapata. Now I'm kind of forgetting my Mexican history, but it's a town where a historical event took place. The Zapatistas took that term and used it as a way to name where the communities in resistance would get together to teach each other. And very quickly, these didn't become sites of armed resistance. Rather, they became sites of community education, community health projects. Traveling doctors would come to Aguas Calientes. In fact, what was striking was, and I visited 2 of them, is I didn't see any sign of an armed revolution anywhere. These were examples of, campesinos teaching campesinos. And it was, it was quite inspiring. A lot of it was just literacy instruction.
Uh-huh.
In some cases, it was Spanish instruction, because that's the common language in a land that mostly speaks different dialects of Maya. And so in that process, myself and a few others in this whole mix, this kind of movement, we arrived in the same city, San Cristobal, with a few internet cafes by this point, and really spent almost 3 months kind of hunkered down and preparing for a water project that we were going to work on. It was to rebuild a town's water line that had ceased functioning. And we ended up rebuilding what's called a captation tank to catch waters from a spring. And that was our main task when we arrived, was to prepare for that. It involved myself and others really quickly learning a lot about basic civil engineering. And it's very simple, hydrology and what have you, relying a lot on publications of other aid organizations, forcing all of us to improve our Spanish when it came to reading many of these documents, and learning where we were going to get parts and tubing and concrete supplies and how we were going to move them. In the process, it's a little complicated to explain, and it was a little opaque to me intentionally, because what we were doing was in an area in resistance to the Mexican government. We also kind of had to lay low and kind of stay at our house. Don't get caught up in there was a large sort of foreigner scene in San Cristobal, which was young people hanging out in nightclubs and in the parks. And we realized a little later, it was basically, we were also being watched for a little while. Even though, and we had, not myself, but others in New York had established these connections with folks. So we knew full well that all these communities had people who were in leadership who were probably also Zapatista members. But what you quickly realized upon settling into Chiapas is that the Zapatista army was actually laying pretty low and hard to identify anywhere. It had a massive public relations effect. And what you saw mostly was Mexican army troops everywhere with roadblocks throughout the area and a lot of road building so that troops could move faster in the future.
Well, one thing that became clear to me from when you talked earlier at the farmers market was that while it may have been internet communication in some places, it wasn't the only means of communication that people had. And I thought that's what would interest our radio audience.
Sure. So after spending a little while, we were asked if we'd be willing to help, we'll call it the organization, with its, we'll call it their media campaign. And so this involved essentially delivering FM radio transmitter equipment to communities. And
FM? I thought you said A. Which one?
Well,
which
also,
is it?
Okay, so both. So one of our group had come down with a complete FM broadcasting kit, more or less ready to get set up. And broadcasting in FM is much, much easier than AM radio. So, but it was a nice demonstration of what could be provided. So you have to understand that I was going down to help with a water project. I wasn't always cognizant at first of everything else that was going on, but we also, the Zapatistas wanted to start up a region-wide radio on AM, which anyone, at least on a hilltop, can pick up in Chiapas. It's very mountainous. And you have to understand it's a little controversial because AM is very easy to trace, and it has a history of being used as a beacon to draw in troops for ambushes. So it had there was a certain tension to it, and they asked if we could go about buying equipment for an AM radio station so they could quietly assemble the parts and then go live as Radio Rebelde. And yeah, that was interesting. We we ended up buying different parts in different cities. And so I got to ride all around the different mountainous towns. And we were given tips on where to get certain items. So it was always interesting. Like, say, we'd go into Comitan, a large city in Chiapas, to get coaxial cable, which is an unusual thing to buy long lengths of coaxial cable, because that's what's used for a way to set up an AM radio station across the treetops of a ridgeline and mountains. You can do that with, I don't know, it's half mile or 1 mile's worth of coaxial cable. And we were recommended to check out this electronic supply store. And of course, I see not long after walking in the top left corner, kind of in the shadows of a shelf, a little Zapatista doll. In other words, a little hand-woven doll that resembles a Zapatista indigenous rebel with a little hand-carved rifle and the black tunics, which the indigenous men were known to wear. And of course, many of the rebels, when they march, because there were no more rebel armed actions at this point, but when they would decide to protest, they'd all wear hoods with just the eyes showing, black knit hoods. And it became sort of a symbol of, not only to a lot of Americans who knew of Marcos, it became a symbol of him, but it was part of the public image. And, in most cases it was symbolic, but so seeing a Zapatista doll hiding off in the background was our assurance that they weren't going to ask questions. And this was actually kept secret quite a few years. I was actually years later, a new school teacher in upstate New York, when I got a message from one of my buddies saying, hey, it's going live. It's not a secret anymore. In fact, and he sent me a link. You can listen to it on the internet. So yeah, Radio Rebelda happened, and I got to play a small part in it as a relatively uninformed courier, we could say, who, the more I discovered what was going on, I remained quite okay with it. And then eventually, we did go into one community near San Andres Larenzar. I've been asked just not to mention the exact community names we were in. And in this case, it's remarkable for someone who worked in publishing and media in New York City, how quickly I got to learn about simple engineering for water systems. And here I was actually with a bunch of other more experienced folks assessing a non-functioning water system that the government had put into this village 30 years ago that never really worked. And, and armed, the knowledge we were armed with, we had only read about in, development, like Oxfam publications. So it was very easy for us to see that they did an awful lot wrong in the construction. This was a bunch of workers who didn't care. They wanted their wages. They weren't trying to, who knows, they might have been from out of town and didn't want to work in these Maya communities, which were very remote. So the community we did go work in, there was no road to it at that point. Mm-hmm. I've since looked.
Yeah, well,
you still go, and there's clearly a road through it now, but it was pretty remote.
Yeah, we are actually out of time. Thank you, Michael Burns. This is a terrific look into the importance of radio, I think, mm-hmm. in leading to social change, as we hope to do here too.
Absolutely. Yes.
This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.